Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. My name is Trina Shanks. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and a professor here at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I use pronouns she, her, hers. I'm wearing glasses, a dark jacket, and a colorful dress. Note about accessibility. I want you to be able to hit the CC for closed captioning, and you'll click show subtitle at the bottom to activate captions if you need that. And in the upper right-hand side, you can toggle between gallery and speaker view. So you can just see the PowerPoint and who's talking as opposed to all the participants. We have a really special session today exploring the history and rise of anti-Asian sentiment, activism around the issue, and Asian American organizing efforts today. Next slide, please. But before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to give a brief land and labor acknowledgement. Engage is aware that we function within a society that has deep history of exploitation, stealing both land and labor that has affected and shaped our Indigenous and Black communities for generations. And so let's just take a moment to read through this land and labor acknowledgement, because we all want to work to create a more inclusive tomorrow. Next slide. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to take a moment to introduce the Engage team. We have Sonia Harb, who's our engagement strategist, Aisha Ghazi Edwin, and Fatima Salman, who are our program managers. We have field interns, Blake Newman and Cleo, and I'm just appreciative to the whole team for all the work they do to make these webinars happen. And with that, I'll turn it over to Aisha, who will be moderating this session.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha Ghazi Edwin. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm a person with short black hair. I'm wearing a gray shirt, and I'll be facilitating the session. So to all participants, this is meant to be an interactive session. If you have questions, put them in the chat. We are going to have some Q&A at the end of the session as well. So as Dr. Shanks described, this is a special session devoted to exploring the rise of anti-Asian American sentiment and the organizing efforts that are trying to combat that. So we have some amazing guests joining us today. The first three are on this slide, and then we're going to get to some students who are also joining us. So please join me in welcoming LSA of American Studies lecturer, writer, and author, Francis K.W. Wang, former Assistant Attorney General of Michigan and Executive Director of American Citizens for Justice, and also a lecturer in the American Studies Department, Roland Wong, President, Executive Director of Street Democracy, Jayesh Patel. And then our three students joining us today are Diana Curtis, Sophia Lingman, and Sophia Aaron, who are all from the API Social Work Coalition. So next, I'd like all of our panelists to take maybe 5 minutes or less to introduce yourselves. So if you could state and everything is on the slide, your preferred pronoun, any identifiers of what you're wearing, your organization or your work. And then if you could also state what generation Asian American you are, and if you were born here, because I'm hoping that this conversation can also lead to discussion about identity. So Francis, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, I'm Francis Kaiwa Wong, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm second generation Chinese American, meaning I'm the children of immigrants from China who came by way of Taiwan. And I was born in Los Angeles, grew up in Silicon Valley, and came here for grad school and have been here ever since. I currently work at PBS NewsHour as a journalist, and I am also an adjunct lecturer or a lecturer at the University of Michigan, Department of American Culture, although not this school year. And and I'm working on a book about the Vincent Chen case and how it has inspired activism and art in the Asian American community.
Thank you so much. Roland, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Aisha. I'm Roland Wong, and I go by he, him, his, and I am wearing a 1/4 pullover and glasses and gray hair. I'm with several organizations, American Citizens for Justice, current president, Association of Chinese Americans. I'm on the Detroit Immigration Task Force, a lecturer in the Department of American Culture, APIA Studies, and a member of LEO, an AFT division. So, and I'm a second generation American, Chinese American. My parents immigrated to the United States as international students from China and met at the University of Michigan. So I think that sums it up. Thanks.
Jayesh, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Jayesh Patel, Street Democracy. I use the he, him, his pronouns. I'm bald with the jacked up hairline, glasses, and a white shirt, button up, collar button up. And my main job is working, I'm a lawyer for homeless people.
And what generation Asian American?
Oh, sorry, born here. My parents immigrated in the 60s.
Awesome, thank you. Sophie, would you like to go ahead?
I'm assuming me, Sophie, because I'm higher on the screen for me. My name is Sophia Aaron. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I have brown hair and I'm wearing a pinkish turtleneck. I'm a master's student in the School of Social Work. I'm also on the API Coalition as vice president. And I am second generation. My mom is from South Korea. And I was born here. I was born in Cleveland.
Awesome. Sophie with a PH, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, everyone. My name is also Sophia Lingman. I use she, her pronouns. I have on glasses and medium length brown hair and a sort of dark greenish bluish turtleneck on. I'm with the School of Social Work on the Global Pathway and School of Environment and Sustainability on the EJ track. And I'm a former board member of the API Coalition at the School of Social Work. I believe I'm third gen Asian American. My grandparents immigrated from Japan in the 50s, and I was born here in Monroe, Michigan.
Very cool. Diana, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Diana. I use she, her pronouns. I have long, dark brown hair and I'm wearing a green, grayish sweater. I'm currently the president of the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition, and I am also a master's student at the School of Social Work. Within the School of Social Work, I'm also the president of the student union right now, and then my full-time work is in mental health and suicide prevention research with the VA and the University of Michigan. I am not sure what generation Asian American I am, only because I've heard the term 1.5 be thrown around, and I think that's what I identify with. I was born in Seoul, South Korea, but we immigrated here shortly, like within my first year of life. So yes, hello.
Hi, welcome. And I think I would identify the same way. So I'm South Asian, Indian, and I immigrated here. I was actually born in England. So I immigrated here when I was 3 years old. So, we have students on with us as well, because after, when the rise of anti-Asian American sentiment was getting really high, you guys did some pretty amazing stuff within the school and in the community to kind of combat anti-Asian American sentiment and just to educate folks, which we're going to get to in a bit. First, I want to just kind of set the context about what happened. So, and Roland, I think that you're going to jump in here. If you want to talk a little bit about the rise in anti-Asian American sentiment that happened in 2020. And if you want me to share your slide, let me know.
Oh, sure. Well, I think that it's important to note that anti-Asian sentiment has never disappeared. It's always been there. It ebbs and flows. And so really, in the context of the history of the United States, you can always draw to incidents of violence over time, whether it is in the aftermath of the gold rush and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, largely by Chinese labor. Then with the downturn in the economy and the finishing of the projects, there was really the anti-Asian hate that resulted in the 1871 mob that had a lot of lynchings in Chinatown, LA, as an example. There were killings in Rock Creek, Wyoming, and Seattle, and so those are indicators, early indicators of anti-Asian violence. And anti-Asian sentiment has always been around, as exemplified by the incarceration of Japanese Americans without any evidence of espionage or sabotage during World War II, the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese. And then we have the Vincent Chen case that led to the founding of American Citizens for Justice and is sort of the watershed case, creating a Pan-Asian civil rights movement in 1983, months after the 1982 killing of Vincent Chen, a 27-year-old Chinese American who the words "because the UMFs were out of work" is really the identifier of that as being a racist act. And so fast forward to the COVID-19 period and the now 9,100 incidents of anti-Asian sentiment, prompted by, I think, in large part by former president calling the flu China flu or Kung flu, rather than calling it COVID-19. And that sort of became sort of a pass for a lot of the anti-Asian violence that we've seen since March 2020. And right now, I think the count is up to about 9,100 incidents. Not all of them are hate crimes. Most of them are hate incidents, just fighting words. But there's certainly a lot of cases of, anti-Asian rhetoric paired with anti-Asian, damage to property and damage to people. So I think there's a continuum of anti-racial, anti-Asian sentiment all through time, but certainly comparing, a mob in LA in the 1870s to the killing of Vincent Chen, a solo event, and then so many thousands of incidents just in the last year and a half or so. Really, it's really a tipping point that we're at in terms of where we are with respect to race relations, from an Asian American perspective.
That's great.
How's that?
And you talk a little bit about how this is connected to the past, right, and past policies. Jayesh, I know that you have talked about this a little bit and you teach about it. Can you talk about kind of like how immigration policies in the past have been discriminatory against Asian Americans, how they've kind of shaped demographics, how we've got here, that this isn't new?
I think Roland is probably the best person for this, actually, in terms of like describing this. But I think the key thing to think through is, rather than like how it manifests itself inside of immigration law, this was in the 1800s or 1880s when they had the Asian Exclusion Act. But what justified this? What was the levers of kind of like human psyche did they pull to kind of convince the masses that our hatred towards Asian Americans was justified? And there's these standard tropes that are kind of used to kind of like do this. So the first is, of course, industriousness. This industriousness is that they're taking our jobs, right? And you'll see this repeated about any different group that comes through, but these are the standard kind of tropes that come through. So the first one is industriousness. They're going to take our jobs. They can work for less money than our people can work for. So it's going to be this net drain of work. that's part one. Part two is, and this is kind of related to this, that is just dirty. So we as Asians are dirty. And this can be part and parcel of the living conditions that kind of were existing at the time for those workers at the when this sentiment started, as well as just general, like, you look different, so you're dirty kind of thing, right? Eat with your hands or whatever it is, kind of like whatever thing you're doing different, the food you're cooking differently, whatever it is, this kind of like dirtiness associated with us. The third trope is stealing our women. So this is kind of like, we kind of touched on this a little bit in our pre-conversation, but this is this trope of they're going to take our women, and then the babies that come will be half Asian. And then over time, our WASP Protestant cultural society will be swallowed up by, actually at the time, this was the Irish were going to swallow us up, and the Chinese were going to swallow us up, and us being America, white Protestants, and then actually the Chinese person ends up swallowing the Irish person at the end, and that was one of the cartoons at the, like, right around the time of the Asian Exclusion Act, and so these types of and then violence, right? And we can talk about a little bit about like how this violence one is that Asian Americans are violent. And this was kind of like the justification of the internment that Roland kind of talked about, right? That they're sneaky and violent with ulterior motives. This kind of also this like, and the fifth trope, this is kind of like a secondary to the violence, is that there's this idea that they're tied to their original culture. So a person who comes from India, China, whatever, or Asia, any foreigner, but it for Asian American purposes, it comes from, you come and immigrate here. Your allegiance and your love, fidelity towards country is tied to the mainland or the motherland, and never really actually tied to here. And you see this like manifest when it's like go back home, those types of like kind of sentiment, and that's where it manifests. Now, each of these also like kind of like these 5 things, like you should take and say there's the flip side coin of this as well, is that they will call you both. So they'll call you both lazy, or industrious and lazy. Like industrious, you're taking our jobs, and lazy, you're taking our benefits. And then that trope will be used twice all the time, all the way down the line. You're violent, but also you're docile. And this goes all the way through kind of like each of these. And so it's only like I think the approach is scattershot, right? I send out all the kind of biases out there, and you don't care that I'm inconsistent. You pick the ones that you like, and that justifies your hatred of that particular group, which then justifies the policy ends of that person who's shooting that out. But I think that's the big point that students need to take away, is that these tropes will be apparent and visible in your work as social work, right? So you see this with, for example, with poor people and drug testing. And this trope of, oh, they use drugs more than wealthy people, when it's not true. They actually use drugs less. But we don't drug test businesses when they get a tax credit, business owners when they get it, before we give them a tax credit, but we do for giving them food stamps. And so these tropes have actual policy implications, but they happen in the context of both immigration externally as well as internally. And so we can talk about that in some other, but I don't want to monopolize time.
No, I think that's great. I think bringing up those tropes are so important. And I think that we saw that kind of reemerge again during that trope about Asian Americans are dirty, right? So around COVID, and even before COVID, people say that Asian Americans eat dogs, or Indians eat monkey brains, or COVID is spreading because Asian Americans were eating bats, right? Mm-hmm. We saw that again. And then obviously Donald Trump just kind of rode that wave. And then we also see, some of these tropes play into what we see as being this model minority myth. that I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit. So like Asian Americans are industrious, but at the same time they're subdued and they are not assertive. And that's why we have the bamboo ceiling, which is that Asian Americans are rarely ever promoted to managerial positions because of these stereotypes. Can you all maybe talk a little bit about, just in terms of your identity, how any of those tropes may have personally affected you? And I also want to open this up to the student panelists as well. Feel free to jump in at any point.
I can volunteer just to say that given the anti-Asian climate, it's really been defining for me individually, but actually probably everybody on this panel, in terms of having to step up and be an activist, to the extent that we, for the most part, weren't organized very well. At the time of the Vincent Chen case, for example, we had to create American Citizens for Justice and then switch hats. We had to create an Asian American Bar Association. We had to create a governor's advisory commission on Asian American affairs because there wasn't one. There was a Latino commission. We've all had to step up and fill some gaps that we really need filling over time. So it's been sort of a learning experience, actually, over the last 4 decades. But it's really across a much longer timeline, because as we teach Asian American history, Asian Americans have been involved in the struggle. Francis, you can certainly chime in, but it's been a battle. And in our civil rights course, we talk about Gong Lum, the case about where does a Chinese American kid in Mississippi get assigned to, the white school or the colored school in 1922, where, where's the ability to naturalize if you're born in a different place but come to America, but you don't speak a heritage language, you speak English, you don't, conduct yourself in any way, shape or form other than in an American, so-called American manner, but you're denied the right for naturalization. Or Page Act, you're a Chinese female wanting to immigrate and you're barred 10 years, about 7 years before the Chinese Exclusion Act, because Chinese women were dubbed prostitutes, essentially. And so family formation couldn't occur after about 1875. And then we were completely excluded after 1882. There's so many laws, alien land laws, immigration laws, like the 1890 Act that pegged immigration to the ratio of the population in 1890. So it's really just sort of an effort pushing against, the forces of the government, to assert ourselves. So that is the history of, the racism overall, which I think results in the anti-Asian racism now, because, it's just that thing that ebbs and flows. So.
Francis, do you want to jump in here? Oh, you're on mute.
Muted.
I knew that. Ask me the question again.
I was just saying, how have some of these tropes potentially affected you with your life? How have you seen it fast?
Well, as a journalist, I've been covering Asian and Asian American communities pretty much my whole career. And so I always try to, well, on the one hand, it's great fun for me to be able to tell these stories that are not told in the mainstream media but lately I've also started, uncovering and telling historical stories that people might not know in the mainstream. And so when I'm writing an article, about a particular ethnic group, say, I always include a paragraph to explain the history behind this. And I really, so I just try to continue. So for me, journalism is not just, the news of the day, but it also includes this wide swath of history And often I have to go back and, find these court documents, from before there was internet, which makes it really difficult. But fun.
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially we've talked a little bit about this, but anti-Asian American sentiment is not new. It's kind of evolved and changed its face throughout history. There have been real policies that have been put into place that have either banned immigration from Asian countries, banned the ability to own property of Asian Americans, despite them contributing to the economy, building the transatlantic railroad. We see it just kind of evolve, right? And then we had COVID-19, and we had Trump saying all the rhetoric that he was saying, and then we had the shooting in Atlanta and Indianapolis. And it's important for people to kind of to see the connection, that this never really went away, right? It just kept kind of changing its face. And also for people to realize that, I think one of the tropes too about Asian Americans is that we don't need activism, that we are fine, that we're doing great. And that has perpetuated this model minority kind of myth. But there is a lot of inequity within Asian American communities based upon country of origin, especially people who immigrate from countries like, if you're Hmong American, if you're a refugee, if you're Vietnamese, people who are paid a lot lower wages than the average white person. Can you guys talk a little bit about the model minority myth and how you've seen that kind of play out and interfere with activism or being taken seriously? Roland, I mean, I'm sure that you can talk about this in relation to American Citizens for Justice, which was, you can talk about what it is if you want to.
Well, the model minority myth was, I guess, started in 1966. I think it was William Peterson who wrote about it in the New York Times. And he was just focusing on the Japanese American community, sort of the idea that here's a population that was incarcerated during World War II, and look at how they've bounced back. They've been in, large part successful, I guess, demographically. In an aggregated sense, they bounce back with, relatively good wages, that sort of thing. But that's a sliver of the story. I mean, right now, we are busy trying to disaggregate the data and show that, for example, with the Pew Research report, Asian Americans really are very, very diverse socioeconomically. And so we do have a sliver of the population that are very well, doing very well socioeconomically, but then we do have large portions of the Asian American community, whether it is Southeast Asian or Hmong or Cambodian, the boat people, more recent immigrants, fleeing war, that certainly populate the lower deciles. And so the Pew report says that actually the spread, the income spread, the socioeconomic spread between the top tier and the lower tier is greater in the Asian American population than for the Black community or the Latinx community. And so there is no real model minority in fact, but there's still the myth, but it's been dispelled by really the real information.
Yep.
And can I add on, just because we're talking this Pew data, you also have to know how to read the data, because a lot of times if people don't know or don't take a moment to think, they don't quite know how to interpret it. So even before you even disaggregate it, right? A lot of times people talk about median household income. You have to account for that Asian Americans tend to have larger households. They tend to have intergenerational households. So you have more people contributing to what is household income. Also, a lot of Asian Americans are disproportionately on the coasts, which have a much higher cost of living, more expensive houses. And so even though they might make more money, it won't get you so far. And so, so anyways, and then you got to disaggregate. So you need to be careful, because I know social work, what's your first class of statistics. You have to learn how to read it. And aapidata.com is a great resource. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Can I also mention that the United States immigration policy cherry picks people who are seeking to enter the United States? You know, if you are a nurse, if you're a doctor, or if you're a IT person, or you have $1 million and could create 10 jobs, yeah, United States is welcoming. But if it's not the case, yeah, and you want to immigrate, it's a lot tougher. It's a lot tougher to immigrate here under, you know, sibling preference and family reunification than it is if you have $1 million and can create some jobs. So really, immigration policy's been cherry picking for decades. So that's the reason why our community has the complexion that it does socioeconomically.
And that's also why, that's how the model minority myth started, right? Because during the 1960s, we're in the middle of the space race, and the US needed scientists and engineers. So they preferentially allowed in people with PhDs who are scientists and engineers. And then America went from a place where there were very few Asians to suddenly every Asian that, you know, quote unquote, you know, people started meeting Asians, and they were all PhDs, apparently, you know, scientists and engineers. And then this stereotype developed that all Asians are scientists and engineers because there must be something about them. They must be good at math and science. And it's really just because, and then in the 70s, there was a medical shortage. And so then doctors and nurses started coming in. And then later on, there was a teacher. This is a briefer moment, but in the 90s, I think, 90s, there was a teacher shortage. So there's a brief window when a lot of teachers were allowed to come from English-speaking countries like India. And so we have these waves of immigration, but it's all determined by the US side, you know, who they need, who they allow in. And so you have to, you know, just be aware of that.
Yeah. And also we have Indians, right, on the H-1B1 visa program, where like you have to have completed a bachelor's to be selected for that program and come here. So that you have, you know, the highest proportion, I think, of Asian Americans by country of origin that have bachelor's or higher are Indians. And that's part of it is because immigration policies have kind of, not artificially, but they have created the economic and social landscape of our demographics as a population, right?
And the
So I want to
Smithsonian
talk.
has a great, oh, sorry. The Smithsonian
Go ahead.
Center has a great art exhibition about the H-1B visa. I mentioned it, it's kind of a weird thing, but it's really great. And I have a little piece in it too.
Nice. Yeah, please do. And we'll be sharing resources with people who attend this after the call. So that would be great. You know, I think too, we have to acknowledge that this model minority myth was also created to kind of differentiate us from Black Americans, and it was weaponized against Black Americans, right? Like we are the exception, like we are the people of color who do things the right way, quote unquote. And we need to also acknowledge there's a lot of anti-Blackness within the Asian American community. I mean, I can speak to it as being a South Asian. And how unfortunate it is because throughout history, the only way we've ever really seen progress is when, honestly, when the Black Indigenous population have come out for us, right? Like I know that the Civil Rights Movement, Black Panthers helping to change 1965 immigration quotas, that was instrumental. So there were quotas in place that would limit immigration from Asian countries. And Black civil rights activists and other civil rights activists fought for those to be done. And it's the reason why my family's here, why we can say most of our families are probably here. I want to talk about that kind of like BIPOC, like intergroup solidarity and the need for it a little bit more. Roland, maybe if you could talk about, you know, after Vincent Chen's case, what did you see in terms of like BIPOC solidarity? Did you see other groups come out for the Asian American community when there was that uprising after Vincent Chen's murder? And if you could even explain who Vincent Chen is for those of us who don't know.
Sure, Aisha. Vincent Chen was a 27-year-old Chinese American who was beaten to death in 1982. And the story of the case was that the assailants, Evans and Nitz, were going through the criminal justice system, and the sentence was just probation and fine, $3,000 fine and 3 years probation. That drew the attention of the Asian American community and led to the founding of American Citizens for Justice, because we thought that the lenient sentence was not justice rendered, for Vincent. So that's what, started the organization. We tried to overturn that decision by Judge Kaufman, but Judge Kaufman wouldn't hear it. We tried to have an audience with Judge Kaufman. We wanted to have an audience with the prosecutor, who didn't have an assistant prosecutor at the sentencing. And ACJ and the Asian American community was unable to get the door open with the judge and with the prosecutor. It took New Detroit, the Urban Coalition, and the NAACP and Anti-Defamation League to weigh in to convince the prosecutor and convince the judge to allow them to, have an audience with ACJ and the Asian American community. And so that was the beginning of sort of a Pan-Asian coalition. We relied on a lot of other civil rights organizations, since we didn't really have one at the time. And that coalition building and structure has continued to this day. That now, when there are talks, panels on anti-Semitism or racism, we're invited along to town halls with the ADL, or issues and answers gatherings at the NAACP Detroit chapter, as an example. So the structure continues to today with a race dialogue program that ACJ is carrying on with the NAACP Detroit and Access, Black Family Development, and the Hispanic Development Corporation. So that's a program that's ongoing to this day. So that's sort of the history of coalition building, at least from American Citizens for Justice's vantage point. And of course, there's a lot of other organizations in the AAPI community that are working coalition with other civil rights groups. A lot of them are working, together under the umbrella of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, a national umbrella. So.
Thanks so much. And also the Vincent Chen case, so this happened in Michigan in the 80s. It was also
That's correct.
Federal
The Detroit
crime.
case, right.
It was the first federal hate crime to ever involve an Asian American victim, right? And that's something that was fought for.
That was a subject of debate between the director of civil rights, Jeff Jenks, and Bob Sedler, the constitutional law professor at Wayne State. Sedler would say the only way Asians would qualify would be maybe the Japanese Americans who were subject to internment. Jeff Jenks took the position that no, the Asian American community has suffered because of things like exclusion, as well as the internment and incarceration. So that was a debate as to whether or not the civil rights laws could be invoked in favor of and for an Asian American victim, at the time. That was a subject of debate. It's clearer now, but back then it was, an issue of debate in 1983.
And we see the same kind of debates reemerging, right? With like what after Atlanta or Indianapolis. And Jayesh, you made a really good point prior to the start of this talk about like who gets to decide when it's racism. Do you want to share a little bit about that? You're on mute.
Who gets to decide what?
whether or not a crime is a hate crime.
Yeah, I think this is actually kind of the conversation we had last year when we had a hate crime. Somebody reported a hate crime. This was a Black Asian youth who was living with their Asian mom, and the neighbor was just basically messing around all the time. They were like attached condos, and they were like, so basically he was just like saying, I'm going to say it just so like you guys can understand it. It was like Jap N-word or chink N-word, and just calling the mom this all the time, perpetually, having his dog poop on her lawn and her porch and things like this, right? And so this is like happening over like a course of a year or so. Finally, we get the call or whatever, and she reports it. They say nothing, and then the daughter installs like a camera to tape the interactions, and then they're shoveling snow, and he's shoveling snow onto her porch, and she's like had enough of it, so she starts shoveling the snow back at him, and ends up like, as she's shoveling, the shovel hits him, or like it looks like it's hitting him, but she definitely threw snow right on him, and then he got mad and pushed her, and we're like, all right, hate crime, that's a hate crime, call it. And so then the lady goes and they report it as a hate crime, and we tried to get it escalated. So first you have to report it to the city, and the city will try to may escalate it. So the county prosecutor wouldn't take it. We tried to get the state prosecutor to take it because they have a separate independent office for this. And so this is where the definition of racism part came in, is that for one, the cop was like horrible in that they were repeating the slurs back without like any muting of it. So there was also, when he said Jap N-word to you, what did you do? When was this? Right. And this back and forth was like just lacking any like, I don't know what introspection consciousness about like the impact of like talking about it that way to this person, to the mom and whatever. And so that's one of it. So, and of course this is like a, person who's never experienced anything like this, right, on the other side. So can't even relate to like what it is that they're hearing. Anyway, here's the part that's so crazy is like racism doesn't happen, in my opinion, like racism doesn't happen in like this one shot, right? Like the time that he pushed her and shoveling snow onto her porch is not an independent act, right? It's like, it's this whole train of like abuses. And both that informed him and his racism, as well as like kind of like that led up to that incident. Like, and her reaction to that incident is not just from the snow, right? It's from the year of hatred, right? So like I react, and this happens with like police brutality. This happens all the time, right? It's like that citizen who acted disproportionate to the officer, or this, in this case, is reacting to a whole train of kind of abuses, not just this one singular point in time taken in a vacuum. And so, and I think this is like going to be, again, your world as social workers, is to understand that the people you encounter are experiencing the world this way. Like, I understand that with defense counsel, right? Like they've been screwed 100 times by bad lawyering. So when they see me, they don't trust me, they don't like me, or they think I'm just like trying to pass them off or whatever. And I think that we all have to like kind of acknowledge that, right? And the stereotype tax and threat that comes from like these history of abuses, we need to acknowledge that. But that tail specifically with hate crimes, right? Like crime is very specific, right? Our ideas of specific intent for committing a crime, one, requiring specific intent versus disparate impact, right? For a lot of like race-based kind of like rules, but two, to like that it's just not temporally like how we work. right? As humans, we don't work and think this way, but like the law is only defined for like, oh, you meant to go take this instrument and hit that other person in the head with it, right? Like that's what you did, even though like, 10 other times you were doing bad stuff all the way up until then. Or like, this is battered wife syndrome, right? Like where the effect finally comes out this way. And to understand this history, now we understand it in this context for domestic violence, at least some people do. And we're not understanding it when it comes to racism. We're expecting people to be perfect, the victim to be perfect. In police brutality, we're expecting the victim to be perfect, rather than the professional to understand the context of the person that they're dealing with.
Can I just venture into this to the extent that it's so much easier to just prosecute a criminal act for it, whatever it is, a beating, a killing, that sort of thing. It's so much harder to prove the racial animus part of it. Particularly you have to focus on what was said, if anything was said. And that was the problem for the Vincent Chen case, because the UMFs were out of work and nip and chink. Is that enough, verbalization to make it a hate crime as opposed to simply the crime against person or property? And that repeated itself with the beating of Than Mai in near Grand Rapids, when he was shoved by a football player and he died when his head hit the ground at a teen bar. And the FBI agent asked me, well, what was said was, what are you staring at, gook? And he did not draw the connection between gook as a pejorative term and the N-word. When I said, they're really equivalent when applied to the Asian population, then the FBI said, okay, we'll treat it, we'll investigate it. But they have to be convinced. And this is me talking to an FBI agent trying to urge that the judge Liebler was too lenient in the Than Mai case, only rendering a sentence of 2 years when he could have sentenced the individual to 15. And there was the effort to try to change the sentence in that particular case and have an FBI investigation. And the FBI needed some convincing in terms of, what was said. Was that a racial epithet? So it's hard to prove racial animus.
Law enforcement, law enforcement is not very well trained in this. And a lot of times, so for example, in Atlanta, right, we all saw the sheriff there. Oh, and also, not only are they not well trained in that, they're not required to report the hate crime statistics to the FBI. It's a voluntary program. And so the FBI statistics are not very good. There's something, but they're not as good as they could be. So I think in Atlanta, we saw that the sheriff very quickly said, oh no, he was just having a bad day, right? And the Asian Americans who have experience in these things, it's like, no, there's clearly a race, there's a racial motivation here. We've been through this all before. We've seen it before. We know this, but, it was just discounted because, I'm just guessing, but the sheriff didn't have experience in this. And because Korean language media was there on the ground talking to people, and the young man apparently said things like, I'm going to kill all Asians. The Koreans reported this, but in Korean. And so the mainstream media that only works in English, they didn't pick this up. And the police and the sheriffs obviously didn't get that. And so, the very beginnings, it was discounted almost immediately, and people had to fight to bring it back into the conversation. Same like the shooting in Indianapolis, it was a FedEx place that had a large population of Sikh Americans working there. When the man was shooting people, apparently he told the people who were not Sikh to get out of the way. And but because Sikhs and non-Sikhs were killed, the FBI, I think, said, oh, but it's not a hate crime because it's not obvious, because he killed other people too. And so which, reports in terms of witnesses are taken seriously and which are not, you know, and how this all kind of gets woven in is you know, part of the, let's say, challenge.
Mhm. And it's like a recurrent thing, right? That Asian Americans always have to try to prove that, like, yeah, we can be discriminated against. We can be victims of hate. And I think it goes back to this trope of like, Asian Americans are fine. Like, they don't experience racism. They're all rich. They're engineers and doctors. And that, again, shows the negative impact on our community, not just others, of this model minority myth. And you guys all bring up a really good point that social workers need to be, because you guys will be immersed in communities, that it doesn't matter if the justice system doesn't call something a hate crime. Any situation you enter in, you have to think about the context and you have to think about the harm. How did these actions or incidents harm the individuals and potentially the community? And what is the context? What is the history of what's going on here, right? Because things don't just happen in a vacuum. There's always a kind of a start to the story. We're getting, you know, we're running kind of a little bit late on our time, and I want to apologize because I can't see the chat. For some reason it's frozen, so I have a colleague kind of texting me it. John Jang, you have a comment, and I want to, if you have the ability, can you unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, I think, so one of the questions we should raise is the importance of critical race theory. I call it critical race practice, because theory sounds like it's, well, theory, but this is reality. So I want to ask that question to all the panelists, to throw it out there. Why is it important today in the 21st century, given this history of racism of BIPOC people? Okay, I will say a couple more comments. It's just that you could go through university and college without ever knowing about race, you know, how racism, the history of racism, which dates back to, you know, 1619, where Europeans were welcome in this country, but people of color were not. So, okay, anybody would like to respond to that?
So I'm gonna ask Diane, Sophie, I can't see what you're writing, but I know that there's a conversation going in the chat. I would love you guys to respond to this, especially because, you know, there was a question John just asked in relation to, you know, going through school and not even learning about hate. So go for it. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. We were discussing in the chat, and this, I think, I mean, I'm speaking for myself in terms of my own personal perspective, but I know this has been an ongoing conversation, not only within the API Social Work Coalition, but also across different affinity and identity groups within the School of Social Work. I know that we have the framework of PODS, privilege, oppression, diversity, and social justice that is supposed to kind of shape our curriculum. And how that actually gets carried out in the classroom can look very different depending on what the classroom environment looks like, and also the instructor's awareness of things like histories of violence against different groups. And I do feel like, even though I think I see and I appreciate the desire to center racism and to center specifically like dismantling white supremacy, I don't know if that conversation always becomes nuanced enough to include all different perspectives. And for example, like when we have conversations about anti-Blackness, I think there's a lot of things that we can speak on about how we've seen anti-Blackness perpetuated within Asian communities, and also what like cross-cultural solidarity movements look like, but that's not something that, a conversation that I've really been able to engage in unless we have created the space ourselves, or I've been speaking with somebody who is API and has that knowledge and that expertise. So I think that, you know, a lot of us sit in our classrooms and I don't know, we're not sure exactly where that fits in with the conversation. And then of course that the focus on pods and the focus on anti-racism, it can feel pretty dissonant when institutionally there is a lot of resistance against calling things like the Indianapolis and the Atlanta shootings racist acts. So sorry, that was a little bit of a ramble, and I can definitely let Sophie and both Sophies speak more on that.
No, Diana, you said it beautifully, and also how you wrote it in the chat. I'll say when it comes to spaces as well, like what you just said, like we created this past summer, which we're going to talk a little bit about, the teach-ins, like we created those spaces and we made them available for people. And not that we didn't want to do it, but that was really put on us because after, and it was intentional that we wanted to work on these because we wanted to educate the community about what the API community was going through at that time, because our teach-ins happened after the Atlanta shootings, and we created a community forum where people came and talked about their experiences that Aisha helped organize along with Diana. And we talked about the model minority myth, and we talked about all of these events that Sophie will also talk about. But it was difficult because we had to create that space for ourselves, and we weren't supported. At least we weren't supported by the university until after we named them as hate crimes, because they were hate crimes. And it was difficult because the university and other people in higher ed were not acknowledging them as that. And we really had to, I believe we released a statement about it. Right, Diana, Sophie? Yeah, it was a while ago. We released a statement about it saying that we needed to name it as such.
Yeah, but what was the reason for pushing back? Like was there like, oh, if we call it this, then this, like there should be I would imagine that there's some kind of worry, right? Like if I call it this, then I have these consequences. So do you know what they're like?
I believe the reason for pushing back was because it had not been named a federal hate crime at that time. It was because like in the news when it was being released, it said that we cannot identify if this is a hate crime yet, even though 6 of the 8 women that were murdered were Asian Americans. And also there was a lot more coming out about the fact it was a federal hate crime, but not named. So that's why we got pushed back.
So it has to be like official. Some official has to like bless it as a hate crime before they would be willing to do or talk about it as a hate crime.
Yeah, and like what you and Roland and Francis were saying earlier, like who names that,
Right.
I put this in the chat, but I do think that a lot of that resistance from calling something a systemic problem means that if you're acknowledging that demands some type of accountability, if you are a leader of an institution that is claiming to be trying to train future professionals to be able to confront these issues, but if you know that you, I think that it's hard because I think naming that as a social problem, but maybe not being equipped because of like your maybe lack of knowledge about the context of the situation, but also like how are our institutions investing in like their students and investing in this curriculum or this instruction or just this cultural awareness at all. So in this specific situation, I'm not sure exactly all of the reasons why there was resistance behind that, but I do know that like following the 2 town halls that the API Coalition hosted, like Sophie said, that kind of led us down our own path when we asked for more curriculum. And actually this Saturday, Aisha and another professor are like teaching a mini course on working with API clients, which we are super excited for, but that's not something to my knowledge that had been offered before. So I do think that there might be some, because when we name things as like a systemic problem, then we are asking also for larger solutions than just persecuting an individual.
Yeah, and sorry, Sophie, you go.
Okay, sorry, I'll go quick. And I do just want to acknowledge that I think the social work field and social work programs have a really big gap in addressing these issues. We saw this with the School of Social Work, where other schools had released statements declaring it a hate crime and that sort of thing, where there wasn't that same pushback. And the social work program is unique, and social work is unique in that this is an opportunity where we should be building on critical race theory. We should be using anti-racist pedagogy, but we see that the field in general is just not progressing at the same rate of other fields. We saw that with Black Lives Matter, where it took several years and a lot of community outcry for the National Association of Social Work to finally release a statement. And even then, it was pretty spineless. So this is not, it's not something new. The social work field has a long history of white supremacy and has a long history of upholding a lot of the things that we're calling out today with anti-Asian hate. And as social workers, we do have a really unique opportunity to engage directly with this material. I'm really proud of our API coalition for doing just that and structuring these events, knowing that because we needed to fill the gap.
That's super cool. Can I keep asking them questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I'm generally like if I'm gonna pick a reductionist, it's gonna be a class reductionist, right? And then like race being the proxy by which class is perpetuated, right? So are you guys? Let me ask you. So like one, that's super cool, like super cool that like asking for institutional change to like address it. But do you think that there are like systemic ways to like change the like the way care is delivered? And I'll give a few examples so you see it in context and see if like you guys are thinking about that. So Obama administration for wage theft, right? Because they wanted to capture wage theft from farm workers. They took the race box off the forms, right? So when you make your claim, you don't have to say your race because they were worried that Latino workers wouldn't check the box or would be scared that this would implicate their immigration status in claiming wage theft. So they took it off, right? Which was cool-ish, except then now we can't see the extent of wage theft that happens in the African American community, right? And to what extent that it affects the African American community more than it does, other communities in America, right? And so we lost some kind of like a metric to do racial, kind of like racial justice work because we wanted to do this other racial justice work, right? Like, you know what I mean? In the idea of being inclusive here. Like we're talking about it in our internal world, right? Like, do we even need to collect sex as a marker? Like we collect sex for many different reasons. Are we making sure we're reaching out to enough domestic violence shelters? Is our pipeline like appropriately demographics to the demographics we're supposed to be seeing, like that homelessness is experienced by, right? So there's some part of this that's like important, right? Like to like understand this, but then also same time is like, by asking that question, either I got to become an expert on, LGBTQ naming convention or whatever, right? And understand that, or I can just kind of like not even have it in the conversation and just be like, I just need your name, your birthday, and your driver's license, or right? Like, and then I'm good. I can research you. I can do your criminal justice stuff, right? And so like thinking through like, in the context of like either outreach to Asian Americans or making it more inclusive, changing the ways like social work either is delivered or kind of thinking through like how social work is delivered now and how that would impact, like how you could change or simplify that process or whatever so that it delivers better services to those populations.
Thank you for like that example and the question. I have a response, but if it's not exactly what you were asking, I apologize. I might have like missed it, but something I was thinking about, because I feel like this is an ongoing conversation across a lot of different topics, but among BIPOC students is, you know, if there are different programs or support options or spaces being provided for BIPOC, like to an extent, for example, the Celebrating Our Roots series that we did last summer, to an extent, it makes sense. And it also, from my perspective, felt very empowering to be given that type of autonomy as an API individual to create that space. And also we had the opportunity to like have a bunch of amazing speakers, and even speakers that weren't able to come to that event specifically, but just knowing how much expertise and information is out there, where we understand that not, especially like non-API and other people in leadership positions might not feel like they have all of the answers or know exactly what to do. So it makes sense that they kind of spin it of like, students, like give us your perspective, and like students, we'll work with you to like help you do this. But then I feel like you kind of have to negotiate that with ensuring that BIPOC students are not being exploited for their labor. So that looks like a lot of things. That looks like fairly compensating, I believe, students. Like when we created this series of teach-ins, like it counted as educational credit, field educational credit for other students who attended. I think it looks like when there are different committees formed that ask for student buy-in and representation, that like there's a line between trying to center student voices and student expertise, and recognizing that our identities are extremely salient, and it might not be the best to just kind of remove the box entirely in that situation. But also, if you're going to be celebrating that, how are you going to celebrate that authentically? By helping us protect our own like mental and emotional energy.
That's cool. Actually, like, so along that line, right? Anything to add? So I think that's like institutional change power, right? Like, I think that's really cool. I really do think that like the one thing I think like us old heads versus young folk is like I feel like we never even thought about that, right? Like we're just like, I mean, maybe Roland Francis, but like it was always just like, this is just part of the job, right? Like this is just like, oh, I'm gonna have to answer where the best Indian restaurant is. That's part of my like need to know environment, right? Like, what's the best Bollywood movie? Oh yeah, I know what's up with Bollywood. Like, yeah, you love it? Great. And that was just kind of like par for course, right? Like, I'm gonna be the one on the panelist to talk about blah blah blah, right? Kind of like you are now today, right? At least you're getting credit for it, Aisha. I'm gonna need some credit somewhere. But do you think there's like in terms of teaching, right? Like the thing with having the course and having like, you know what I mean? Like that's like, to me, like do you have any more like that where you're like the way you're teaching social work could be enhanced by thinking through how to serve Asian Americans better? What would that policy look like, or what would that process look like? And then, so that, because I feel like you guys are going to be leading institutions soon. So you'll be able to design programs, design the parameters, what qualifies for sufficient proof or whatever, are they homeless or whatever area, like those same box questions and threshold questions that we face with racism externally is going to be internally with, proving XYZ. Sophie.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of change, and then there's also not a lot of change. Social work is super institutionalized, and especially clinical social work, they really, really love, all the intake forms that you have to fill out and the psychoanalysis you have to do. And I'm not a clinical social work for much of that reason, that I just don't mesh with that. And I may be wrong, but I believe Sophie and Diana also don't really focus on clinical social work. But there's been a big push for this sort of decolonized approach to clinical work. And we had a speaker who actually talked a lot about that, where it's a return to, in a lot of ways, traditional and indigenous cultural approaches to healing and to the idea of what pain and trauma and hurt look like and what those remedies are, and having them be culturally situated and having practitioners who know how to walk their clients through what that cultural context looks like. In terms of teaching, I mean, it looks like a lot of different things. We have some really, really wonderful professors and lecturers, Aisha being one of them, who have wonderful models for teaching pods and for talking about anti-racist practice and API identities. I don't know if I see that push without student work though. I mean, we have the course we have because students pushed for it and we had faculty support us. Had students not pushed for it, I don't think this class would have been created within the time frame it was.
That's the same for APIA studies. It wasn't created but for the fact that a lot of students wanted it at the University of Michigan. We wanted to follow the model of Berkeley and San Francisco State.
Yeah, the whole history of ethnic studies comes out of student movements and student coalitions across race. That's how ethnic studies was born in the 60s. So those are the takeaways: coalitions, solidarity, and make trouble, good trouble.
And to be aware of how the model minority myth really harms us, right? And that it doesn't really fairly, it covers up the real experiences of certain groups. And we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to other BIPOC populations to really fight against it.
Aisha, I just want to say back to the box conversation that we were having, Jayesh.
Mhm.
I did my undergrad in music, and we've been having, my dad is also a cellist, and he was talking about orchestras, and a lot of orchestras are, being cut because of the pandemic, not enough funding from the government. But there's been a large conversation about getting rid of the curtain. There's a curtain during auditions that I don't know if you've ever seen like Mozart in the
Putting
Jungle.
up the curtain, right? It's putting up the curtain so it's blind.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
actually from putting up that curtain, there are so many women in orchestras, and there are a lot of Asian Americans in orchestras.
Oh, they got to take it down?
Yeah, well, they're pushing to take it down.
Right.
Because they want more diversity within orchestras, which is it is true. There are not many African Americans, not other people of color that are in orchestras, but it's also, I don't know if this is answering a question or if it's a complete thought, but it's really interesting the fact that, it's a literal curtain. You're taking down the curtain and looking at what's going to happen when it's not there. So
this is very interesting. So this is very similar to California with the university admissions, right? So when they took away the race-based admissions, right, and too many Asians are getting into Berkeley, there was the backlash, like, hey, we got to stop this. We didn't know we were going to be the ones that were going to get trounced by this. And I think there's some solutions, right? Like, so Texas, actually, I think it's my favorite one so far. Race neutral. It's a certain percentage at every high school gets to go to the flagship university. So 3%
10% of the graduating class in Florida, Texas.
Yeah, it gets to go to Texas Austin. So it's pretty good. I mean, it still has its own internal kind of like stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Do you think there's veils like this inside of the world of social work, like for access? So like I'll give you the example for us, right? So like the most challenged person is the person living on the street for us, right? And they're also the brick wall that, like, there's congregate living versus separate living at the shelters. You have to give them all your information. So like that trust barrier, being forced to live with people is like, so all these things that are like, oh, this is how we're doing things, are the exact barriers to like getting into this and access to the service? Are you seeing those kinds of either like barriers in kind of like the experiences you've seen thus far in terms of like the delivery of social work, or where the choke points are, so to speak? Or what would be a great example of a decolonized approach? Because like maybe I don't know what I like, you know, like there's some cool stuff you guys are doing and I don't even, you know what I'm saying? Like I don't know what I'm like, I'm exposed to something different.
Yeah, so Sophie Langerman mentioned, and she had to hop off. And she did mention that the three of us are not focused on like the more interpersonal clinical side of social work, but something that I learned, like I am taking the intro, like the foundational course now. And we did have a conversation at one point about treating Asian American clients because the professor assigned I think it might have been a TED Talk or a YouTube video discussing treating, Asian American clients and also cultural differences. And it was really interesting because I feel like there's a lot of language about what to expect in terms of treating people with like cultural competency, but there's not a lot of recognition about how diverse, like when you say Asian American, that can mean a lot of different things. Even when I don't even think it said Asian American, I think it said Asian. So like in terms of like people's so many different factors. And I thought this video did actually a pretty good job talking about like how it's very diverse and people's assumptions about Asian clients being very good at treatment adherence because of the stereotypes of Asian, especially Asian women who seek services, like being docile and listening to the doctor and following the rules and quote rules and things like that. But I actually like talked about like I think it did a good job like talking about how cultural values and ideas about mental health and mental health treatment are going to influence how people interact with their practitioners. But and I also thought it was valuable because that information was coming from somebody who is API. And I think sometimes like people are put into the position where they have to train like in essentials, like a foundation course, like you have to have your section on like cultural competency or like cultural humility, but there's so much to cover. And a lot of times, especially depending on the textbook, like it'll be a sentence where it's like Asian Americans are more likely to have internalized disorders, and there's a lot of stigma around having a mental illness, so they might not want to talk about it, and like that's it. So there's not, and also that's not even necessarily true. So again, I don't know if this answers your question because I asked this question in class, you know, like what for those of us who are planning on becoming clinicians, like what does that look like in the actual field? Like the honest answer, and I respect my professor a lot for saying this, is like that's just then you become responsible for seeking out that information and educating yourself, and hopefully you work in an organization where there's a diverse group of practitioners and they can help you out too. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have any answers.
And can I answer? That actually is the key, right? You have to go out and educate yourself, because a lot of times I've spoken with medical students. A lot of times the studies say, you know, everyone should have, let's say, 1,000 milligrams of calcium. Well, who is everybody, right? When they did the studies, if you go back to the original studies, everybody is really only white males, right? And so so the conclusion may or may not be true, but has anyone done the study? How do you interpret it, right? So when you've been taught things like, you know, everybody's this way, or this is the way it should be done, when you're talking about communities of color, this may or may not be true, because they may not have been in the study or part of the original population when these, or even the clinicians, when all of these procedures were developed. And so that's something to think about. And so for me, just, you know, in my writing and raising kids, I've had to do a lot of research, like going back to the original studies and going back and just challenging. It's very easy to just accept what, you know, we're told, but you have to challenge every little thing and question it and say, well, does this make sense for me? Like just for like a really mundane example, all my life I was told, if you don't take a shower after you swim, your hair will turn green, right? And I just took this because I've been told it all my life. Everybody says that. And then one day my kids, when they were little, they saw like some guy walking down State Street with a bright green mohawk. And they said, that guy did not take a shower after swimming because his hair's green. And it suddenly occurred to me, right? Because I had parroted it to kids without thinking that no, right? Only blonde hair will turn green, Asian hair will turn brown. But I just took it. I just never even thought about it. So question not being said, what's not being asked is a very difficult skill. You'll develop it as you keep going. Keep reading, learn a lot.
Yeah. I think for instance, like that's super interesting because like we were talking about this same kind of like dynamic with DSM and how depending on social class, depending on race, depending on wealth, these kinds of diseases actually manifest differently. And so what would be let's say depression, for example, like depression in a certain group, in let's say a pro-dominant group, might be representative as a withdrawal or, you know, kind of like avoiding. But it, and, you know, I don't know anything about DSM. I'm just saying that I know that this part exists, but like that, but then it manifests as like anger or hostility in other places, or you know, just like kind of like, and then we ascribe our own kind of like how we would react if we were X to this person and their behavior, and then say that they must be Y, you know, because if I was X, I would act like this. And if I was Y, I'd act like that. And they're acting like Y, so they must be thinking the way I think. I forget, there's a cognitive bias name for this, but I think that would be like a very interesting thing to see or research maybe when you're out, like where these kind of like manifestations end up being different, and then like how that would affect like either clinical or diagnosis. But I think we see this in school discipline all the time, where you see, you know, kids are acting up and they're not a bad kid, or they're getting ascribed a bad kid when the predominance is poverty, right? Or comorbidity with poverty or whatever. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting kind of like thing that we like know a little bit about, and I think we know more than we do. Like I think we're like all in like Dunning-Kruger like effect, right? Like we're all just like, hey, oh yeah, we totally figured that out, but we don't.
And sometimes it turns into like, so how do we take what we've established or what we considered evidence-based practices such as CBT or other things that are very much, they were researched and developed within a white space. How do we apply this to our API or other BIPOC clients? And I actually did my undergraduate thesis about schizophrenia and paranoia and how our cultural ideas of what is considered like ideas of persecution or ideas of like, oh wow, like everybody's against me, like how that are actually like very valid thoughts for some people to be having. And like there are fears that some of us have that are rooted in intergenerational trauma and systemic and racialized trauma. And that doesn't, I think a lot of times people are not equipped to treat that when that comes up, because of course that leads to different mental health outcomes. But trying to apply like the same type of Band-Aid on that, it a lot of times can just perpetuate harm and then prevent people from getting the healing that they need.
Wouldn't those studies come out of California where the populations are significant enough to have representative samplings of the API community? Might not be around here, but when you have 15% of the population, at least you have enough numbers to work with.
Yeah. So I think this is a super interesting conversation, and I think it really kind of wraps. We should end on this, on that. What we're all here kind of trying to say is that one of the roles of social workers and just of a good human being is you should approach every individual as if they're a unique person. They have unique experiences. But then they're also shaped by kind of the collective experiences of the group that they belong to. But that you also will never understand someone's experience. And you have to know how your own perspective has been shaped by your own life, right? By your own kind of stories about whose hair is going to turn green and whose isn't. So if we could close it on that note, I think that's powerful and it's important. And I know that each of you all have, you know, so many resources that are so rich. And if you want to send those, I can share them with all the participants. But otherwise, I want to thank you all for being on. We're almost at time. And yeah, thank you for the great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.